Fire smells different when it's burning human flesh. Sweeter, sickly. I learned that lesson tied to a wooden stake, while my prince, my supposed best friend, watched me burn for a treason he committed. My blind loyalty bought me a match. Waking up 5 years earlier, lying in the mud exactly 10 minutes before that same prince rode into a fatal ambush, I didn't draw my sword. I just stood up, dusted off my knees, and walked the other way. Rainwater tastes like copper when it washes over a bloody lip. That was the first thing I registered. Not a divine choir, not a tunnel of white light, just the gritty iron-heavy taste of wet dirt and my own blood. I gagged, choking on a lungful of cold air, and rolled onto my side. The ground beneath me was soft. Too soft. It was the deep, sucking mud of the Kingswood. I dug my fingers into the earth. It was freezing. A moment ago, a lifetime ago, a breath ago I was burning. I could still feel the phantom blistering on my forearms, the flesh pulling tight and splitting like overcooked meat. I could still hear the roar of the flames and the polite, detached murmurs of the nobility who had gathered in the courtyard to watch the traitor hang, to watch me burn. I squeezed my eyes shut, expecting the heat, expecting the agony that had finally stopped my heart. Nothing, just the freezing rain soaking through my wool tunic, heavy and scratchy against my skin. I opened my eyes. My hands were buried in the mud. I pulled them out, staring at them, trembling. The skin was pale chapped from the cold, smeared with brown muck. But the knuckles were whole. The jagged, ugly scar that had snaked up my left forearm from an assassin's blade 3 years from now, gone. The burn marks, gone. Get up from the dirt, Desmond. You look like a beaten dog. The voice hit the back of my neck like a physical blow. A cold spike of adrenaline slammed into my chest. I knew that voice. Arrogant, slightly nasal, laced with the lazy entitlement of a boy who had never been told no in his entire miserable life. I turned my head slowly. The rain was coming down in sheets, matting my hair to my forehead. There he was, Prince Graham. He was sitting atop his massive white gelding, looking utterly ridiculous in his pristine, silver-threaded riding cloak. He was frowning down at me, a mixture of disgust and boredom on his sharp, aristocratic face. Beside him, Captain Finn was scanning the dense tree line, his hand resting on the pommel of his sword. We were in the gorge, Widow's Crossing. My mind snapped the pieces together with violent clarity. It was the 3rd year of King Edward's reign, the diplomatic mission to the northern barons. We had taken a shortcut through the Kingswood because Graham had complained about the smell of the common roads. And I had just been thrown from my horse after it spooked at a thunderclap. In exactly 3 minutes, a crossbow bolt was going to tear through Captain Finn's throat. In my previous life, I had screamed a warning. I had thrown myself over Graham, taking a poisoned arrow to the shoulder that had left me sweating and rotting in a fever dream for 2 months. I saved his life. I became his hero, his right hand, his loyal dog. And 5 years later, when the Northern Rebellion reached the capital and the king demanded a scapegoat for the missing treasury funds, Graham had gambled away. Graham had handed me over. He signed the execution order with the very pen I had bought him for his name day. Desmond, Graham snapped, clicking his tongue. Are you deaf? Get on your horse. My boots are getting damp, and I refuse to spend another hour in this wretched forest. I stayed on my knees. The rain dripped off my nose. The wind howled through the pines, a low moaning sound that masked the rustle of the mercenaries shifting in the branches above us. I knew they were there. I could almost smell the cheap oil they used to grease their bowstrings. I looked at Graham, really looked at him. I searched for the charismatic leader I had worshipped. I saw only a weak, petulant boy with a weak chin and cruel eyes. I felt a hysterical laugh bubble up in the back of my throat. I swallowed it down, but a quiet, jagged sound escaped me anyway. Is something funny? Graham's voice dropped, taking on that dangerous, offended edge he used right before ordering a whipping. I didn't answer him. I slowly pushed myself up from the mud. My knees ached. My head throbbed from the fall. I felt beautifully, painfully alive. I looked at my horse, grazing calmly a few yards away. Then I looked at the dense brush to my right, completely off the path, leading back toward the southern foothills, away from the crossing, away from the capital. Desmond, Finn barked, now sensing the tension, though he misunderstood the source. Mount up. The prince gave you an order. No, I said. The word was quiet. The rain almost swallowed it, but Graham heard it. His jaw went slack. Excuse me, Graham sneered. I said no. I didn't yell. I didn't draw my sword. I didn't give him a grand speech about betrayal and time travel and the smell of burning flesh. He wouldn't understand. He didn't deserve to understand. I unbuckled my heavy steel breastplate. My fingers were stiff from the cold, fumbling with the leather straps. The armor hit the mud with a dull, heavy thud. It was government issue. It belonged to him. Have you lost your mind? Graham demanded, his voice cracking slightly. He looked around as if expecting someone to jump out from the trees and explain the joke. Someone is going to jump out from the trees, I thought, just not with an explanation. I quit, I said. I turned my back on the future king of the realm. I took a step into the thick brush. The thorns immediately tore at my wool trousers, scratching my skin. It felt real. Desmond, you take one more step and I'll have you hanged for desertion. Graham's voice was high-pitched now, hysterical. I kept walking. Mud sucked at my boots. Wet branches slapped my face. I didn't look back. I didn't run. I just walked. I was maybe 50 yards deep into the dense undergrowth, the sounds of Graham's indignant shouting fading behind the curtain of rain. Thwack! The heavy, sickening sound of a steel-tipped bolt sinking into meat. Graham's shouting stopped instantly. A second of absolute, profound silence. Then the screaming began. It was a wet, tearing sound. The scream of a horse followed instantly by the panicked, gargling cry of a dying man. Finn. The bolt had taken him in the throat, just like before. I stopped. I stood there in the dark green gloom of the forest, the rain hammering against my skull water, running down my spine. My hand instinctively twitched toward the empty scabbard at my hip. I had left the sword with the armor. A phantom reflex from a dead man. More shouts. The clash of iron on iron. The guttural roars of the northern mercenaries, dropping from the trees like hungry spiders. Save him. The instinct was a parasite in my brain, bred by years of conditioning, years of taking the blow so someone richer didn't have to. Turn back, pick up a rock, do something. I closed my eyes. I pictured the courtyard. I pictured the executioner, tying the rough hemp rope around my wrists, pulling it so tight, my hands went numb. I pictured Graham standing on the balcony, swirling a cup of wine, looking bored. I opened my eyes. I took a breath of cold, pine-scented air. I kept walking. I didn't sneak. I didn't run. I just moved with the slow, steady rhythm of a man who had nowhere to be. The sounds of slaughter continued behind me. They echoed off the rocky walls of the gorge, bouncing through the trees. The sickening crunch of bone, the desperate shrieking pleas of the royal guards. Desmond. Help, Desmond. Graham's voice. It cut through the rain, frantic, stripped of all its royalty and arrogance. It was the sound of a terrified boy, realizing for the first time in his life that his name couldn't buy his way out of bleeding. A heavy knot formed in my stomach. It wasn't guilt, it was nausea. The sheer, ugly reality of death, unromantic and brutal. I had seen plenty of it. I had caused plenty of it. But walking away while it happened to someone else, someone who legally owned my life, felt like breaking a physical law of the universe. I half expected lightning to strike me. I waited for the sky to open up and smite me for my treason. Nothing happened. The rain kept falling. My boots kept sinking into the mud. By nightfall, the screams were hours behind me. The forest had given way to a rocky, winding path that led down toward the valley. My muscles burned. Every joint in my body ached with a deep, throbbing exhaustion. I was soaked to the bone, shivering violently, my teeth clicking together like castanets. Through the gloom, I saw a dull orange glow. It was a wayside inn, a miserable, sagging structure made of rotting timber and river stone, slumping against a hillside, as if it had given up trying to stand straight. A wooden sign swung violently in the wind, groaning on rusted hinges. The Boar and Barrel. I pushed the heavy oak door open. The heat hit me first. Thick, stifling, smelling strongly of wet wool, cheap tallow candles, and sour yeast. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever smelled. There were maybe a half-dozen people inside. A few loggers huddled by the hearth nursing mugs of ale. A merchant snoring in a corner. The innkeeper, a heavy-set man with a deeply scarred cheek and a greasy leather apron, looked up from wiping down the scarred bar. He didn't ask questions. You don't ask questions of a man who walks out of the Kingswood at night with no armor, no sword, and a haunted look in his eye. I reached into the hidden pocket of my tunic. My fingers were so numb, I could barely feel the rough fabric. I fished out 3 silver coins, my personal savings, not royal coin. I slapped them on the sticky, splintered wood of the bar. "Ow!" I croaked. My voice sounded like grinding stones. "A bed. And if you have anything hot that resembles food." The innkeeper scooped the coins with surprising speed. He pushed a cracked clay mug across the bar. The ale was dark flat and tasted faintly of dirt. I drank it in 3 long gulps. It burned going down, settling in my empty stomach with a heavy grounding warmth. I slumped onto a stool. The wood was hard. It dug uncomfortably into my thighs. I sat there dripping water onto the floorboards, staring at the flickering flames in the hearth across the room. I watched the fire dance. I didn't flinch. It was just a fire. It was cooking a pot of stew, not roasting my flesh. I was alive. Graham was dead or captured. Either way, the grand tapestry of the realm had just been ripped down the middle, and I was sitting in a rotting tavern drinking bad beer. I looked down at my hands. They were filthy, shaking slightly from the cold. I wiped the mud off my thumb, revealing the pale skin underneath. No burns. A strange sound escaped my chest. A low, ragged exhale. I wasn't happy. I wasn't triumphant. I just felt an overwhelming, crushing sense of exhaustion. I rested my forehead against the sticky wood of the bar, closed my eyes, and let the darkness take me. 4 days. That's how long it took for the world to end. I spent those 4 days chopping wood for Cobb the innkeeper. The 3 silver coins only bought me a bed and 2 meals. I needed to keep eating, and chopping wood kept me warm. It also kept me from thinking. The axe handle was slick with my sweat, the wood polished smooth by years of use. I swung, feeling the satisfying violent shock of iron biting into pine. The rhythm numbed the knot behind my eyes. Wood, axe, breath, splinter. It was honest work, tangible. When you strike a log, it splits. It doesn't smile at you, drink your wine, and then sign your death warrant. On the afternoon of the 4th day, the war arrived. It didn't come with banners or trumpets. It came in the form of a terrified, half-starved farmer pulling a handcart, missing a wheel, his wife carrying a screaming infant, their faces smeared with ash. Following them were dozens more, a ragged, weeping procession of refugees spilling out of the valley road. I buried the axe into the chopping block and wiped my brow with the back of my hand. The air felt heavier today. The wind had shifted, blowing down from the north. It smelled faint, but distinct. Smoke. I walked around to the front of the inn. Cobb was standing on the porch, wiping his hands on his dirty apron, staring open-mouthed at the crowd filling his muddy yard. A soldier staggered toward the trough. He wasn't royal guard, just a local conscript wearing a padded jack that was soaked dark with dried blood. He collapsed against the wooden trough, plunging his head into the dirty water. I walked over to him. I grabbed the back of his collar and pulled him up before he could drown himself. He gasped, coughing up water, his eyes wide and vacant. "What happened?" I asked. My voice was flat. I already knew. I just needed the details. The north. The boy wheezed his teeth, chattering despite the heat of the afternoon. "They broke through the garrison at Red Hill. They're burning everything." "Where is the king's army?" Cobb yelled. From the porch, panicked. The boy let out a wet, hysterical sob. "There ain't an army. Not here. The king sent them all to the border. They took the prince, the northern lords, at Widow's Crossing, slaughtered his guard, and dragged him off." Cobb turned pale. "The prince captured." "Worse," the boy whispered. He looked at me, his eyes bloodshot and terrified. "They sent pieces of him back to the capital. A finger, an ear. They're demanding the kingdom surrender the northern territories, or they'll send his head next. The king has gone mad. He ordered the fields burned to starve the rebels. Our own soldiers are torching our farms." I let go of the boy's collar. He slumped back against the trough. They took him alive. A cold shiver crawled up my spine. In my previous life, I had taken the arrow. We had fought them off. We rode back to the capital as heroes. Graham kept his fingers, his ears, and his arrogance. The rebellion was crushed a year later because the king had time to mobilize. Because I wasn't there to take the arrow, Graham was captured. The rebellion exploded. The king panicked. The kingdom was tearing itself apart. I looked past the weeping refugees, past the broken carts and the dying soldiers. I looked toward the northern horizon. A thick, oily black cloud was rising over the distant hills. It spread across the sky like a bruise, blotting out the afternoon sun. The air was growing hazy. Ash-light as snowflakes began to drift down, on the wind settling on the mud of the tavern yard. "God save us," Cobb muttered, making a holy sign over his chest. He looked at me. "What do we do Where do we go? He was looking at me like a leader, like a soldier who knew how to save people. I hated that look. I had spent 2 lifetimes trying to be the man who saved people, and all it got me was a steak and a match. I looked down at my hands. I had fresh blisters from the axe handle. My fingernails were caked with dirt. My back ached. I was a peasant, a deserter, a nobody. And for the first time in 2 lifetimes, I belonged entirely to myself. "You pack what you can carry, Cobb," I said, my voice empty of comfort. "And you walk south. Keep walking until you don't smell smoke anymore." "What about you?" he asked, his voice trembling. I turned away from the blackening sky. I looked at the half-chopped pile of wood. "I'm going to finish chopping my wood," I said. "And then I'm going to eat my stew." I walked back around the side of the inn. I pulled the axe from the block. I didn't feel like a mastermind. I didn't feel the dark, twisted satisfaction of vengeance. I just felt hollow. A hollow, tired man standing in the ashes of a world he refused to save. I swung the axe. It bit into the wood. The sound echoed loud, masking the weeping from the yard. Let it burn. The ash tasted like burnt hair and old copper. It settled on my tongue, caught in the back of my throat, and coated the remaining stew in Cobb's iron pot with a gritty gray film. Cobb was gone. He had packed a single rucksack, locked the front door of the Boar and Barrel, as if a rusted iron bolt could keep out a war, and joined the endless shuffling line of refugees heading south. I had stayed. For 2 days, I sat in the dim, stale air of the empty tavern. I ate the rest of the stew cold. I drank the flat ale. I listened to the silence. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was the heavy, suffocating quiet of a held breath. The birds had stopped singing. The crickets were dead. There was only the low, constant hum of the wind carrying the destruction of the northern territories down into the valley. I knew I couldn't stay. The provisions were gone, and the cold was seeping through the floorboards. But my body refused to move. The sheer inertia of 2 lifetimes of following orders had evaporated, leaving me anchored to a wooden stool staring at a dead hearth. Then the door splintered open. I didn't flinch. I just slowly turned my head. 3 men stumbled into the taproom. They weren't Northern rebels. They wore the tattered, mud-stained surcoats of the King's infantry. Deserters. They smelled of stale sweat gangrene and the sharp, sour tang of fear. The largest one, a thick-necked brute with a jagged cut across his nose, kicked a chair out of his way. He saw me sitting in the corner, half hidden in the shadows. He froze his hand, dropping to the hilt of a rusted short sword at his belt. "Tavern's closed," I said. My voice was a dry rasp. The brute exchanged a look with the other 2, a pair of gaunt, hollow-eyed boys who looked barely old enough to hold a spear. "We ain't looking for a drink, peasant." The brute spat. He drew his sword. It scraped against the scabbard, a terrible, grating sound. "We're looking for coin, food, and horses. You got 10 seconds to tell us where the innkeeper hid his stash before I open your throat." I looked at his sword. Then I looked at my empty hands. I had left my broadsword in the Kingswood mud. I didn't regret it, but it made the current mathematics of the room problematic. "I'm a guest," I said, leaning back against the rough timber of the wall. "I chopped wood for my supper. There's nothing here." "Liar." One of the boys snapped, his voice cracking. He lunged forward, leveling a spear at my chest. I didn't think. The muscle memory of 100 battles kicked in, bypassing my exhausted brain. I shifted my weight, letting the spear tip bury itself into the wood paneling inches from my ribs. Before the boy could pull it free, I grabbed the wooden haft, jerked him forward, and drove my knee into his face. Bone crunched. Blood sprayed across my knuckles, hot and sticky. He dropped like a stone. The brute roared and swung his sword in a wide, clumsy arc. I threw myself backward, rolling over the sticky, ale-stained floorboards. The blade cleaved the stool I had just been sitting on, embedding itself deep into the wood. My hand scrambled in the dark beneath a table and found the heavy iron fire poker I had seen Cobb use 2 nights ago. It was thick, coated in soot. The brute wrenched his sword free and lunged at me again. He was bigger, stronger, but he was driven by panic. I stepped inside his guard, taking a glancing blow to my left shoulder. The dull steel tore through my wool tunic, biting into the flesh. White-hot pain flared, but I ignored it. I swung the fire poker upward. It caught him under the jaw with a sickening wet crack. His teeth shattered. He collapsed backward, crashing through a table in a tangle of splintered wood and limbs. The third boy was standing by the door, his spear trembling in his hands. He looked at the boy bleeding on the floor, then at the brute gurgling in the ruins of the table. Then he looked at me. I stood there, my breathing heavy, my shoulder throbbing. The poker in my hand was heavy. I was tired, so deeply, profoundly tired. "Go," I told him. He dropped his spear, turned, and ran out into the falling ash. I dropped the iron poker. It clattered against the floorboards. I pressed my hand to my shoulder. The cut wasn't deep, but it bled freely, soaking the wool. I cursed quietly, stripping off the tunic to bind the wound with a rag I tore from a linen tablecloth. I looked at the brute on the floor. He was dying. I didn't feel a surge of victory. I didn't feel like a survivor. I just felt annoyed. The world wasn't going to let me sit in a corner and rot. It was going to keep coming for me, dragging its dirty boots across my floor, demanding that I participate. I walked over to the dead boy. He was wearing standard-issue leather boots. They were worn, but sturdy. I kicked off my own expensive royal-issue riding boots, the kind that would immediately mark me as a wealthy man or a thief, and pulled the dead boy's boots onto my feet. They were half a size too small. They pinched my toes horribly. It was a small price to pay to disappear. I stepped out of the tavern, leaving the door hanging on its hinges. The sky was completely gray now. I turned south, leaning into the wind, and joined the long, miserable road. The southern road wasn't a road anymore. It was a churning river of mud, chewed up by thousands of panicked feet, the heavy wooden wheels of overloaded handcarts, and the occasional frantic hooves of a horse. It smelled like wet wool, unwashed bodies, and the sharp ammonia of fear. I walked. The boots I had taken from the dead deserter rubbed the skin off my heels within the first 2 miles. By the second day, I could feel the blisters pop, the warm, wet slip of my own blood soaking into the rough wool socks. Every step was a sharp, biting agony. I welcomed it. The pain in my feet kept my mind focused on the ground. It kept me from looking up, because when I looked up, I saw the things I was refusing to save. I saw an old man sitting in the ditch, cradling his dead wife's head in his lap, staring blankly at the sky. I saw a mother carrying a toddler whose breathing was the terrible wet rattle of pneumonia. I saw young men with fear in their eyes, clutching pitchforks and rust-pitted hatchets, waiting for a northern army that was already busy butchering their neighbors. You're limping, friend. Better pick up the pace, or the crows will use you for a roost. The voice came from my right. A rickety flatbed wagon was trundling alongside me, pulled by a mule that looked more bone than flesh. The driver was a wiry man with a face like a dried apple and missing front teeth. He wore a greasy felt hat pulled low over his eyes. "I'm fine," I muttered, keeping my head down. "Suit yourself," the old man said, spitting a stream of dark tobacco juice into the mud. "Name's Harlan. This miserable creature is Barnaby." He tapped the mule's rump with a thin willow switch. We walked in silence for another hour. The mud sucked at my boots, threatening to pull them off with every step. My shoulder throbbed with a dull, insistent rhythm. "Got room on the back," Harlan said abruptly, not looking at me. "For a toll." I looked at his wagon. It was piled high with burlap sacks of grain and a few meager pieces of cheap furniture. "I have no coin," I said. "Didn't ask for coin." Harlan grunted. "Barnaby's struggling. You push when we hit the inclines. You can rest your bleeding feet on the flats. Fair trade." I stared at him. He didn't know me. He didn't owe me anything. In my past life, traveling with Graham, the commoners would dive into the ditches to avoid the royal procession. If a wagon blocked our path, Graham's guards would flip it over and beat the driver for insolence. I had watched them do it. I had stood there in my gleaming silver armor and let it happen because it was the natural order. I walked to the back of the wagon and put my hands against the rough, splintered wood of the tailgate. Fair trade. For 3 days, that was my life. The rhythm of the road. On the flats, I sat on the edge of the wagon, my bloody, swollen feet dangling over the mud, watching the refugees trail behind us like ghosts. On the hills, I leaned my shoulder against the wood, digging my boots into the slick earth, straining until my vision swam with black spots to help Barnaby push the load over the crest. On the 4th night, we camped on a high ridge overlooking the Blackwater Valley. Harlan shared a piece of stale hardtack and a skin of sour wine. We sat by a small smokeless fire, listening to the murmurs and coughing of the thousands of people camped around us. I looked down into the valley. In the distance, glowing against the black canvas of the night, were a dozen angry orange fires. They weren't campfires. They were massive, entire villages burning. "The king's work," Harlan said softly, following my gaze. He took a pull from the wineskin. "Scorched earth, they call it. Burn the fields, burn the silos, burn the homes. Leave nothing for the northern rebels to forage. It leaves nothing for his own people," I said, my voice barely a whisper. Harlan laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "Since when has King Edward ever cared about his people? The royal family only sees us when they need taxes or bodies for a war. They lost the prince. The king is lashing out like a wounded bear tearing apart his own den." I stared at the fires. In my previous life, I was the one who rode ahead to those villages. I was the one holding the torch. I had stood in the town squares, reading the royal decree, telling weeping farmers that their livelihood was a necessary sacrifice for the crown. I had believed it. I had believed Graham when he told me we were the shield of the realm. A sharp, phantom pain laced up my left arm. The memory of the execution pyre. The smell of my own flesh cooking. I dug my nails into the palm of my hand until the pain grounded me. "You look like a man who's seen a ghost," Harlan noted, tossing a small twig into our fire. "Something like that," I said. I lay down in the mud, turning my back to the burning valley, and closed my eyes. I didn't care about the king. I didn't care about the rebellion. Let them burn each other to cinder. The bridge over the Blackwater River was a bottleneck of misery. It was mid-morning when we hit the tail end of the congestion. 1,000 carts, wagons, and exhausted people pressed together, moving forward inches at a time. The air was thick with panic. A rumor was rippling backward through the crowd, passed in frantic whispers from person to person. The Royal Army had secured the bridge. I sat on the back of Harlan's wagon, a cold knot forming in the pit of my stomach. Through the gaps in the crowd, I could see the glint of halberds in the dark crimson surcoats of the King's Inquisition. They weren't here to help the refugees cross safely. They were here to sift through the ashes. "Toll collectors," Harlan muttered, spitting into the mud. "Vultures." I slid off the wagon. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to vanish into the woods. But the woods on either side of the road were steep, rocky ravines. There was no way to get a wagon through, and on foot, I would be hunted down by the outriders patrolling the flanks. We inched forward. The sound of weeping grew louder. When we were 50 yards away, I saw him. Captain Hale. He was standing on a wooden crate near the bridge entrance, overseeing the search. Hale was a cruel, fastidious man who smelled of rosewater and enjoyed the sound of his own voice. In my past life, he had been a rival. We had sparred in the courtyard. He hated me because I was a commoner who had risen to the king's inner circle. If he saw my face, he would know me. And if he knew me, he would know I was supposed to have died in the Kingswood with the rest of the prince's guard. The penalty for abandoning a royal detail was death. The penalty for abandoning the prince to be mutilated by northern rebels. They would invent new ways to keep me alive, just to hurt me. "Harlan," I said, my voice low. "I need dirt." Harlan looked back at me, his brow furrowed. Then he looked at the soldiers. He didn't ask questions. He leaned down, scooped a handful of wet black mud from the wheel rut, and handed it to me. I smeared it across my face. I worked it into my hairline, over my cheekbones, darkening the pale skin. I rubbed it onto my neck and forearms. I hunched my shoulders, pulling my torn tunic tight, transforming my posture from a trained soldier to a broken, shivering peasant. "What are they looking for?" I whispered. "Deserters," Harlan whispered back, "and scapegoats. Here they're hanging any man who survived the Kingswood ambush. The king needs blood to wash away the shame of the prince being taken." My stomach tightened. "Next," a guard barked. Harlan whipped Barnaby, and the wagon lumbered forward to the checkpoint. 2 soldiers stepped up. One began jabbing a spear into the sacks of grain. The other, a young man with nervous eyes, looked at Harlan. "Destination?" the soldier asked. "South," Harlan croaked. "To my sister in Oakhaven. Got nothing but grain and a bad back." The soldier walked around to the back of the wagon. He stopped in front of me. I kept my head down, staring at my bloody, mud-caked boots. I let my jaw hang slack, breathing shallowly through my mouth. I made myself small. "Who's this?" the soldier demanded. My nephew Harlan lied, smoothly. "He's simple. Took a kick from a horse to the head when he was a boy. Doesn't speak." The soldier leaned in. I could smell the stale wine on his breath. He grabbed my chin and wrenched my head up. I kept my eyes vacant, staring past his shoulder, letting drool pool in the corner of my mouth. Every muscle in my body was coiled like a spring. If he yelled, if he called for Hale, I would have to kill him. I would have to take his sword, cut a path to the bridge, and dive into the freezing rapids. "Captain," the soldier called out. My heart slammed against my ribs. Hale hopped down from his crate and strolled over, his crimson cloak dragged in the mud. He looked bored. He looked at Harlan, then walked to the back of the wagon. He stood right in front of me. I could smell the rose water. "What do we have here?" Hale drawled. "Just a simpleton, sir," the soldier said. "Traveling with the old man." Hale looked at me. His eyes narrowed. He stepped closer. I held my breath, keeping my gaze fixed on the gray sky above his head. He studied the mud on my face, the grime on my neck. Then he looked down. He was looking at my feet, at the dead deserter's boots. They were military issue, stripped of insignias, but the cut of the leather was distinct. Hale slowly drew his dagger. Military boots on a simpleton. My hands twitched. This was it. Before I could move, a heavy hand smacked the back of my head. "You stupid boy!" Harlan roared, stepping around the wagon and shoving me hard in the shoulder. I stumbled, playing along. "I told you to leave those boots on that dead soldier. We're gonna hang because you wanted warm toes." Harlan turned to Hale, pulling off his greasy hat and bowing so low his nose almost touched the mud. "I beg your pardon, my lord. We found a dead man in a ditch 2 miles back, ripped open by a bear, looked like. The boy got greedy. He doesn't know any better. Please, I'll take them off him right now." Hale sneered, stepping back to avoid Harlan. He looked at the bloody blistered mess of my ankles, where the small boots had chewed away the skin. It looked pathetic. It looked real. Hale slid his dagger back into its sheath. "I don't have time to execute scavengers today." Hale spat, turning away. "Get this filth across the bridge before I change my mind." Harlan didn't hesitate. He whipped Barnaby, and the wagon jerked forward. I walked behind it, keeping my head down, my breath shaking in my chest as we crossed the wooden planks. We made it to the other side. We kept walking until the checkpoint was a mile behind us. I looked back. The bridge was swallowed by the gray haze of the burning kingdom. I had survived. I had slipped through the net. But as I looked at the red, raw skin of my own hands, I realized a terrible truth. You can walk away from the fire. You can refuse to be the hero, but you still have to breathe the smoke. Oakhaven wasn't a haven, and the oaks had been logged a generation ago to build the king's warships. It was a sprawling, muddy depression in the hills, surrounded by miles of neglected orchards. We arrived at dusk. The smell hit me a mile out. It was the heavy, fermenting stench of rotting apples. The ground beneath the bare branches was carpeted with them, brown and soft, crushed into a sweet, alcoholic paste by the boots of 1,000 desperate refugees who had beaten us here. Harlan's sister, Martha, lived in a low stone cottage at the edge of the largest orchard. She was a hard, angular woman with hands like dried leather and a perpetual scowl deeply etched into her face. She didn't weep when Harlan arrived. She just looked at his emaciated mule, looked at my muddy, bruised face, and pointed to a leaky wooden barn out back. "Barn's dry enough. Don't touch the seed sacks," she rasped, turning back to her boiling laundry pot. For 2 weeks, I lived in that barn. I became a laborer, a shadow. I woke before dawn, the frost biting through my thin wool blanket, and spent the daylight hours digging trenches in the frozen, unyielding earth to redirect the winter runoff. My hands, once calloused from the grip of a broadsword and the reins of a war horse, blistered anew from the rough handle of a rusted spade. The physical pain was a welcome anchor. It kept my mind tethered to the dirt, but the silence in my head was deafening. In my first life, my days were dictated by the rhythm of the court, the clash of steel in the training yard, the hushed, frantic whispers of political maneuvering in the corridors, the constant, suffocating pressure of keeping Prince Graham alive against his own staggering incompetence. I had been a loaded crossbow, constantly drawn, waiting for the trigger to be pulled. Now, there was only the hollow thud of my spade hitting rocks. I tried to blend into the misery of Oakhaven, but the war seeped into the valley like a slow-moving poison. The town square swelled with tents and lean-tos. The bakers stopped baking because there was no flour. The local magistrate, a fat, sweating man named Corliss, locked the town's granary and doubled the town guard, posting them at the doors with loaded crossbows. Hunger changes the air. It sharpens it. You can hear it in the way dogs stop barking and start prowling. You can see it in the way neighbors look at each other's pockets instead of their faces. I sat on a wooden crate in the barn one evening, wrapping my cracked knuckles in strips of a ruined burlap sack. The wind howled through the gaps in the wall, carrying the faint, high-pitched crying of a child from the refugee camp a mile away. Harlan walked in, carrying a single shriveled apple and a dull knife. He sat on an overturned bucket across from me, methodically, cutting the rotten spots away. Corliss is raising the road tax again tomorrow, Harlan said, his voice flat. He didn't look at me. He just carved away another brown chunk of apple. Says it's to pay for the extra guards. Truth is, he's starving out the refugees to force them south and bleeding the locals dry while he does it. I pulled the burlap tight across my knuckles and tied it off with my teeth. I tasted dirt and old thread. It's his town, I said softly. Harlan stopped cutting. He looked up, his watery eyes fixing on me in the dim light of a single tallow candle. You got a coldness in you, boy, Harlan muttered. I saw you on that road. I saw how you handled that royal guard at the bridge. You ain't no simpleton, and you ain't no farmer. You're a man who knows how to use violence. But you sit in this barn like a whipped dog while the world eats itself. I am surviving, Harlan, I replied, leaning back against the rough wood of the stall. That's all there is. Sigh, surviving ain't living. Harlan spat. He tossed the mangled core of the apple into the dirt. If you don't pick a side, the side gets picked for you. Remember that. He stood up his joints, popping in the cold, and shuffled out of the barn. I stared at the apple core in the dirt. A black beetle was already crawling over it, navigating the bruised flesh. I felt a slow, dark irritation coiling in my chest. I had walked away from the throne room. I had walked away from the king, the rebellion, and the grand destiny that had bought me nothing but a fiery execution. I just wanted to be left alone in the mud. But Harlan was right. The world doesn't let you sit out the game. It just changes the board. The next morning, the board changed. I was at the edge of the property, swinging a heavy iron splitting maul into a stubborn oak stump. The air was frigid, my breath pluming in thick, white clouds. The rhythm was hypnotic. Swing, crack, breathe. A scream shattered the morning. It was a sharp, guttural sound, followed by the dull thud of heavy wood striking flesh. It came from Martha's cottage. I froze. The maul hovered midair. Every instinct drilled into me by the royal guard screamed action. My muscles coiled, ready to sprint, ready to draw a weapon, ready to kill. And then the new instinct The cynical, exhausted survivor slammed the brakes. Not your problem. Walk into the trees. Keep walking. I stood there for 3 seconds. 3 agonizing seconds of absolute paralysis, torn between the ghost of the hero I was and the coward I was trying to be. Then I heard Harlan beg, "Please, it's for the seed. Just leave the seed." Crack. The sound of a boot hitting ribs. I dropped the splitting maul. It hit the frozen ground with a heavy dead clang. I didn't grab it. It was too heavy, too slow. I walked toward the cottage. I didn't run. Running makes noise. Running elevates the heart rate. I kept my breathing slow, my footsteps light on the frosted grass. I rounded the corner of the stone wall. There were 4 of them, Magistrate Corliss's thugs. They wore boiled leather vests over thick wool and carried iron-shod cudgels. 2 of them were dragging sacks of Martha's winter grain out of her root cellar. The 3rd was holding Martha against the wall by her throat. The 4th was standing over Harlan. The old man was curled in the mud, bleeding heavily from a split eyebrow, clutching his ribs. The magistrate said a 50% tax old man. The thug sneered, raising his heavy wooden cudgel again. "You got 4 sacks. We're taking 2. You complain again, we take all 4 and break your other leg." I stepped into the yard. The gravel crunched under my ill-fitting boots. The thug, standing over Harlan, stopped. He turned his eyes, sweeping over my mud-stained clothes, my wrapped knuckles, my empty hands. He let out a short, ugly laugh. "Get lost, stable boy, before I break your skull too," he barked. I looked at Harlan, gasping in the mud. I looked at Martha, her face turning purple. I looked at the grain sacks. I didn't feel a surge of righteous fury. I didn't feel a heroic duty to protect the innocent. I just felt a profound, suffocating exhaustion. The arrogance of men with power. It never changed. Whether they wore silk and silver crowns or boiled leather and cheap iron, the cruelty was exactly the same. I hated them for making me do this. "Let her go," I said. My voice was quiet dead. The thug, holding Martha, laughed. He looked at the man with the cudgel. "Teach the boy some manners, Pike." Pike smiled. He cracked his neck, gripped his cudgel with both hands, and stepped toward me. He was heavy, slow, and overconfident. He telegraphed his swing a mile away, pulling his right shoulder back to deliver a crushing blow to my head. I didn't step back. I stepped in. Pike swung. The iron-shod wood cleaved the empty air where my head had been a fraction of a second before. Before his momentum could carry him forward, I drove the heel of my palm into the side of his knee. The joint gave way with a wet, sickening pop. Pike screamed, dropping the cudgel as his leg folded sideways. As he fell, I caught the collar of his leather vest, stepped behind him, and used his dropping weight to drive his face squarely into the jagged stone edge of the cottage wall, bone shattered. Pike went limp, sliding into the dirt, leaving a thick smear of dark blood on the frost-covered stone. The yard went deadly silent. The remaining 3 thugs stared at me, their sneers evaporating into shock. They had expected a starving peasant. They didn't know they were looking at a man who had survived 3 northern campaigns and 100 court assassinations. "Kill him," the one holding Martha yelled, dropping her and drawing a rusted short sword from his belt. The 2 men carrying the grain dropped their sacks and pulled daggers, rushing me at the same time. I kicked Pike's falling cudgel up into my hands. It was heavy, unbalanced, but it was wood and iron. It would do. The first man lunged, slashing wildly with his dagger. It was a street fighter's move, sloppy wide, driven by anger. I batted the blade away with the shaft of the cudgel, the impact vibrating up my forearms. I didn't counterattack immediately. I spun the cudgel, bringing the iron-shod base down hard on his leading instep. He shrieked, his balance collapsing. I stepped cleanly to the side and swung the cudgel like a blacksmith's hammer, catching him directly in the ribs. I felt 3 of them snap under the blow. He collapsed into the gravel, coughing blood. The second man hesitated. He looked at his 2 bleeding friends on the ground. His eyes darted to me. He saw no anger in my face, no fear, just the dead mechanical focus of a butcher working a carcass. He turned and bolted for the road. "Coward!" the leader roared. He gripped his short sword, his hands shaking slightly, and stepped over the groaning man in the gravel. "You're a dead man. Corliss will hang you from the town gates. Corliss isn't here." I said, my voice barely a whisper in the freezing air. He lunged. It was a better strike, a straight thrust aimed at my stomach. I pivoted, letting the rusted steel slide past my hip, tearing the fabric of my tunic. As he overextended, I dropped the cudgel, grabbed his wrist with my left hand, and twisted violently upward. The tendons in his arm tore with a sound, like ripping canvas. He screamed, dropping the sword. Before the blade hit the ground, I caught it with my right hand. I didn't hesitate. I drove the pommel of the sword brutally into his face, his nose crushed inward. He staggered backward, blinded by his own blood, gasping for air. I stepped forward, kicked the back of his knees out, and pushed him face first into the mud next to Harlan. I stood over him, the rusted short sword resting casually against my leg. My breathing was even. My hands weren't shaking. I looked down at the men groaning in the dirt. I had saved Harlan. I had saved the grain. But the cold knot in my stomach only pulled tighter. This wasn't a victory. This was a death sentence. You don't beat a magistrate's men and stay in his town. I looked over at Harlan. He was sitting up, wiping the blood from his eye, staring at me with a mixture of awe and absolute terror. Martha was leaning against the wall, coughing, rubbing her bruised throat. She wasn't looking at me with gratitude. She was looking at me like I was a rabid wolf that had just wandered into her yard. "Pack your things," I told Harlan, tossing the rusted sword onto the dirt. It clattered against the stones. "What?" Harlan croaked. "They know my face. They know yours," I said, turning away, feeling the familiar exhausting weight of a fugitive's life settling back onto my shoulders. "Corliss will send 20 men by nightfall. They won't ask questions. They'll just burn the cottage with us inside." "Where do we go?" Martha rasped, her voice bitter. "The north is burning. The capital is miles away. This is my home. Your home is gone," I said bluntly. I didn't have the energy for empathy. I didn't have the energy to cushion the blow. "We go into the woods. We keep moving." I walked over to the thug with the broken nose. He was moaning, trying to push himself up. I grabbed the leather pouch tied to his belt and ripped it off. It jingled heavily. Silver coins, Corliss's taxes. I walked back to the barn. I grabbed my thin wool blanket, my rusted spade, and my stolen boots. Running away from the fire hadn't worked. The sparks had just followed me on the wind. I realized then, with a bitter clarity, that there was nowhere left to hide. The kingdom was dying. It was a rotting corpse, and the maggots were fighting over the meat. If I wanted to survive, I couldn't just walk away anymore. I was going to have to start stepping on the maggots. We left Oak Haven an hour before noon, cutting through the dense snow-dusted pines to avoid the main road. Harlan led Barnaby the mule, struggling under the weight of the 2 grain sacks we managed to save, plus the few pots and blankets Martha had thrown together. Martha walked in silence, her jaw set tight, casting venomous glances at my back every few minutes. She blamed me for the loss of her home. She was right to. I walked point. I had taken the short sword from the yard, despite its rust. It was a terrible weapon, poorly balanced the edge, dull and nicked, but the familiar weight of cold iron at my hip changed something in my posture. I didn't hunch my shoulders anymore. I walked with the measured, silent tread of a hunter. We moved deeper into the Blackwood foothills. The air grew colder, biting through our clothes. By nightfall, we found a small overhang of jagged gray rock that offered some shelter from the wind. We couldn't risk a fire. The smoke would lead Corliss's trackers right to us. We sat in the freezing darkness, eating raw grain and shivering. "There's a rumor," Harlan whispered, suddenly, his voice brittle in the cold. I looked at him. Only his silhouette was visible against the snow. "Heard it in the square yesterday before the taxes." He continued, wrapping his arms around himself. "A rider came through from the capital. The king is dead." I stopped chewing. The silence of the forest seemed to press in on us. "Dead," Martha whispered. "How?" "A stroke, they say," Harlan replied. "Or poison. Doesn't matter. The rebellion reached the city gates 3 days ago. The king collapsed on the throne when he heard the siege engines. The city is surrounded. The royal guard is broken." I stared into the black woods. King Edward, dead. The man who had sneered at me from his balcony as the flames licked my boots. The man who had ordered my death to cover his son's cowardice. He had died, terrified, trapped in his own stone cage, watching the empire he bled dry crumble around him. "And the prince?" I asked. My voice was eerily calm, devoid of the triumphant vindication I thought I would feel. "Graham." Harlan spat the name like a curse. "The rebels paraded what was left of him in front of the Capitol gates before they started the siege. He's dead. The whole royal line is gone. There's no one left to give orders. No one left to stop the burning." Martha let out a low, despairing sob, burying her face in her hands. "It's the end of the world." I leaned my head back against the cold stone of the cave wall. I closed my eyes. I pictured Graham. Not the mutilated corpse paraded by rebels, but the arrogant silver-clad boy who had looked down at me in the mud of the Kingswood just weeks ago. I had walked away. I had refused to take the arrow. By saving my own life, I had doomed the entire kingdom. In my past life, my sacrifice had bought them time. It had bought them stability. It had kept the king on his throne and the borders secure right up until they decided I was no longer useful. A hollow, jagged laugh escaped my throat. It echoed off the rocks, startling Harlan and Martha. "You find this funny boy?" Harlan demanded, his voice thick with fear and anger. "The realm is bleeding out and you laugh." I opened my eyes. I looked at the old man and his sister, huddled in the freezing dark, stripped of everything they owned. "I don't find it funny, Harlan," I said quietly. "I find it perfect." I reached down and rested my hand on the pommel of the rusted short sword. The iron was freezing to the touch. It grounded me. For 200 years, this kingdom rested on the backs of men and women like you. I said, my voice hardening, shedding the disguise of the mute simpleton shedding the broken deserter. They taxed your grain. They took your timber. And when they needed blood, they took your sons. They convinced you it was an honor to die, so they could drink wine from silver cups. I stood up. My muscles ached, but the suffocating exhaustion that had plagued me since I woke up in the mud was gone. It had burned away, leaving a cold, hard clarity in its place. The king didn't protect you. I looked toward the south, toward the unseen burning capital. He was a parasite. The prince was a coward. The rebellion isn't a tragedy. It's a reckoning. Martha stared up at me, terrified. Who are you? Nobody. I said truthfully. A dead man who refused to burn. I walked to the edge of the overhang and looked up at the sky. The clouds had broken slightly, revealing a few scattered indifferent stars. The air smelled of pine needles and distant smoke. I wasn't going to save the kingdom. I wasn't going to join the rebels. I wasn't going to be a hero, and I wasn't going to be a victim. The board was broken, the pieces were scattered in the mud, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't a pawn being moved by a royal hand. I drew the short sword. The rusted blade hissed against the leather scabbard. I inspected the nicked edge in the faint starlight. It was an ugly weapon for an ugly world. "Get some sleep, Harlan," I said, sliding the blade back into its sheath. "Tomorrow, we head west toward the coast. If Corliss's men follow us, they die. If the rebels cross our path, they die. We don't bow to anyone anymore." I sat back down at the edge of the cave, facing the dark woods. I rested my hand on the cold iron. Let the kingdom burn to ashes. I would rule the dirt. The kingdom has fallen. The royals are dead. And Desmond has finally stopped running. If you got chills when he drew that rusted sword and chose his own dark path, you have to smash that like button. This marks the end of his escape and the beginning of a brutal new reign in the shadows. What would you do in Desmond's shoes? Hide or fight back? Drop your answers in the comments. Don't forget to share this epic Reborn saga with your friends. And hit subscribe with notifications on so you never miss our next dark fantasy series.